We're still at the very start of our journey, tracing the birth of modern political thought during the seismic shifts of the 1600s, the era of scientific breakthroughs and philosophical reinvention. Last time, we began with Thomas Hobbes, the thinker who framed the existential puzzle of human society. Why do we need government at all? Hobbes didn't just speculate, he aimed to prove it like a mathematician proving a theorem. Imagine Euclid, but for politics, Hobbes sought irrefutable logic to show that government isn't just useful, but inescapable, as vital to order as geometry is to shapes. His goal? To turn obedience into an axiom, as self-evident as 2 plus 2 plus 4, or even the existence of God. Today we pivot to John Locke, who picked up Hobbes's gauntlet but ran in a radically different direction. If Hobbes gave us the problem, Locke offered the solution, one that would redefine freedom, rights, and the very purpose of power. Let's dive in. His method, borrowing from René Descartes, was to make the fewest possible assumptions about the nature of man, the universe, or the human good. Unlike previous philosophers who started with conjectural assertions about the human good, e.g., Platonic justice or Christian community, Hobbes avoided defining good or evil. Instead, he began with an uncontroversial premise. People are attracted to pleasure and repelled by pain. They call pleasurable things good and painful things bad. This seemed axiomatic, a clear, distinct idea, as Descartes called it. From this, Hobbes argued people are self-interested, rationally calculating means to achieve satisfaction. He termed this pursuit power, the ability to secure one's goals. Crucially, he claimed this quest for power is endless, ceasing only at death. In the hypothetical state of nature, without government, individuals constantly size each other up as means to their ends, leading to perpetual uncertainty and fear. Life becomes a war of all against all, where no one rests securely. Hobbes concluded the only remedy is an absolute sovereign authority. Rational individuals, recognizing the chaos of the state of nature, would unconditionally surrender all rights to this sovereign. Any reservation of rights, idaigu private judgment, on morality, property, or majority rule, would reignite conflict. For example, reserving aesthetic judgment over property could lead neighbors to destroy each other's possessions. Similarly, majority tyranny or moral absolutism would destabilize society. Thus, Hobbes argued, sovereignty must be absolute and unreserved. Any exception risks returning to anarchy. Hobbes' conclusions were polarizing. Starting from seemingly reasonable premises, he arrived at authoritarianism. Much of Western political thought since has aimed to refute him. Ironically, his logic also underpinned liberal democracy. John Locke later used similar social contract, reasoning to argue for limited government and individual rights, the antithesis of Hobbes' absolutism. Before examining Locke, context is key. Hobbes wrote during England's turbulent 17th century, the Stuart monarchs' push for absolutism, the Cromwellian Revolution, and the Restoration. Hobbes sided with royalists, advocating sovereignty as a bulwark against chaos. Locke, writing later, engaged with these same upheavals but reached starkly different conclusions. John Locke, the restored Stuart monarchy began auspiciously with Charles II, who sought to reconcile with Parliament and acknowledge the nation's interests. However, James II, or his successor, openly promoted Catholicism in an increasingly Protestant England. His political ineptitude alienated the rising middle-class commercial groups, the Whigs, who aligned with parliamentary rights over royal authority. Tensions escalated through the 1670s, 1680s, culminating in the Whig-controlled Parliament deposing James II in 1688. They invited William of Orange from the Netherlands to assume the throne, marking the Glorious Revolution. William's ascension transformed British governance. Unlike his predecessors, he derived authority not from divine right or heredity, but from Parliament's consent. This established the principle that the monarchy ruled by parliamentary approval, fundamentally shifting constitutional power. Parliament's supremacy became evident. It could both grant and revoke authority. The king now reigned but did not rule absolutely, heralding a constitutional monarchy rooted in popular will. John Locke, a Whig scholar and politician, provided the theoretical foundation for this new order in his second treatise of civil government. Though not explicitly refuting Hobbes, Locke engaged with the social contract tradition to justify limited government and individual rights. His background, studying Descartes, science, and medieval philosophy, shaped his empirical, scientific approach to politics. Locke began with Hobbesian premises. Humans pursue self-interest, pleasure, pain avoidance, and rationally calculate means to their ends. Yet he diverged sharply in describing the state of nature. For Locke, natural reason fosters mutual respect and reciprocity. Enlightened self-interest leads individuals to recognize that cooperation optimizes collective security and fulfillment. Unlike Hobbes's anarchic war of all against all, Locke's state of nature is a tacit social order where people respect property, refrain from harm, and resolve disputes through reason. Locke argued that while most adhere to natural law, a criminal class inevitably exploits this harmony. Governments form not to escape perpetual war, as Hobbes claimed, but to address these imperfections, adjudicating disputes, punishing violations, and protecting rights. Crucially, Locke's social contract reserves individual rights, life, liberty, property. Governments derive legitimacy from consent and forfeit authority if they violate trust, justifying revolution, a direct defense of the Glorious Revolution. Locke's theory underpins liberal capitalism. By framing property rights as natural and labor-driven, he justified private accumulation while advocating fair competition. His vision of enlightened self-interest, where individuals balance personal gain with communal welfare, resonates in market societies. For Locke, rational actors negotiate mutual restraint, e.g., dormitory quiet hours, avoiding Hobbesian chaos through collective agreements. Yet Locke acknowledged limits. Without formal institutions, free riders and criminals destabilize voluntary order. Thus, government becomes a neutral arbiter, securing rights through laws rather than imposing moral absolutes. This framework laid the groundwork for constitutional democracy, where authority is delegated, conditional, and always accountable. To the governed, in Locke's state of nature, imperfections persist. A criminal element may exploit mutual goodwill, acting purely on selfish interests. Additionally, disputes arise without an impartial adjudicator. For instance, one person's midnight Beethoven appreciation might be another's sleepless torment. Such conflicts risk reverting to Hobbesian chaos, but Locke argues these are exceptions, not norms. Most individuals, guided by enlightened self-interest, maintain order. Government emerges as a pragmatic solution to these flaws. Locke frames it as an invention, a tool to codify laws, enforce property rights, and resolve disputes fairly. Unlike Hobbes, Locke sees government not as a desperate necessity, but as an improvement on an already tenable state of nature. Rational. Individuals weigh its benefits, enhanced security for life, liberty, and property versus the freedoms of anarchy. Crucially, Locke's social contract is conditional. Governments gain legitimacy only if they protect natural rights more effectively than the state of nature. Citizens surrender absolute freedom in exchange for structured laws and impartial justice. If a government fails this test by overreaching into moral dictates or self-aggrandizement, it forfeits legitimacy. This principle underpins Locke's defense of revolution, as seen in the Glorious Revolution. Locke's legacy in modern debates. Lockean logic permeates contemporary politics. Abortion. Opponents argue government must protect life, fetal rights. Proponents frame it as a personal liberty issue. Both sides invoke Locke's rights framework. Social Security. Critics decry coercion, claiming individuals should freely manage retirement savings. Supporters counter that mandatory safeguards prevent free riders from exploiting communal safety nets. Taxation. Progressives justify redistributive policies to ensure equal liberty. Libertarians denounce them as infringements on property rights. Locke's radical innovation was rejecting government's naturalness. Unlike Aristotle's political animal or Augustine's divine ordination, Locke treated government as a human contrivance, optional and subject to rational scrutiny. For the first time, legitimacy hinged on consent and utility, not tradition or divine mandate. Locke's theories revolutionized political thought. By framing government as a conditional contract, he empowered individuals to demand accountability. His ideas laid the groundwork for liberal democracy, constitutionalism, and modern capitalism. Yet Locke's genius lies in balancing realism and idealism, acknowledging human flaws while trusting rational self-interest to forge cooperative societies. Next, we'll explore Locke's political economy, property rights, and the theory of majority rule, cornerstones of the liberal tradition. The idea of natural rights, while discussed by Stoics and Christians, gained new vitality in Locke's work. He argued that life, liberty, and property exist independently of government. They are inherent to human experience. Government's sole legitimacy lies in protecting these rights, not pursuing abstract ideals like absolute justice or the common good beyond this mandate. Locke is often hailed as the father of classical liberalism, advocating minimal government, limited to 3 roles: national defense to protect against external threats, criminal law to safeguard life, liberty, and property from domestic harm, civil law, particularly contract enforcement, to resolve disputes impartially. Classical liberals, e.g. Milton Friedman, Ronald Reagan, interpret this as governing least governs best. Any state action beyond these roles, welfare, regulation, paternalism, is seen as illegitimate overreach. Locke's most radical contribution was framing property as natural, preceding government. In the state of nature, individuals claim ownership by mixing labor with resources, e.g., clearing land, building a cabin. This labor confers an intuitive moral right, making theft inherently wrong even without formal laws. A settler works for months building a homestead. A stranger claiming it without labor would provoke moral outrage, illustrating Locke's view that property rights are innate. Implications for governance: taxation as theft, arbitrary seizure of property, e.g. nationalizing foreign investments, redistributive taxes, violates natural rights. Debates in Lockean terms: abortion, clash between right to life and personal liberty, Social Security, coercion versus preventing free riders, progressive taxation, balancing equality and property rights. While Locke's defense of property underpins capitalism, his criteria for legitimate ownership introduce nuance, labor justification. Ownership requires mixing labor with resources, enough and as good. Proviso: appropriation must leave sufficient resources for others. Non-waste condition: hoarding perishables, e.g. letting food rot, invalidates claims. These caveats suggest Locke's theory isn't absolute laissez-faire. He acknowledges limits to accumulation, opening debates about distributive justice and government's role in ensuring fairness. Locke's ideas revolutionized political economy by naturalizing markets and problematizing state power. Yet his framework fuels both conservative, minimal state, and progressive, rights protection ideologies. For instance, classical liberals emphasize property rights and limited government. Progressive liberals argue unchecked inequality undermines liberty, justifying state intervention. Locke's genius lies in creating a flexible framework for debating governance, rooted in the timeless tension between individual rights and collective welfare. Locke's political theory centers on opposing arbitrary rule, government actions without rational justification tied to communal welfare. Tyranny, in Locke's view, is governance divorced from reason, where authority acts on whims rather than principles. A president invading a country because I felt like it. A judge ruling against a defendant because I always rule for plaintiffs on Thursdays. A DMV examiner denying a license because it's cold and I don't like your face. A professor grading without transparent criteria. A boss berating employees due to a bad mood. These scenarios provoke moral outrage because they violate Locke's principle that legitimate authority must justify itself through reason. For Locke, government exists to protect life, liberty, and property. Any action failing this test is illegitimate. Locke outlines two social contracts, forming a community. Individuals surrender absolute self-judgment to collective authority, establishing government, delegating power to institutions that enforce laws impartially. Locke advocates for separation of powers. Legislative, creates laws reflecting majority will. Executive, enforces laws and manages daily governance. Federative, handles foreign affairs, war, treaties. He rejects absolute monarchy, arguing concentrated power inevitably leads to tyranny. Instead, Locke endorses representative government where officials act as trustees of the people's trust. Locke defends majority rule as the fairest way to reflect collective consent. However, he emphasizes limits. Majorities cannot violate natural rights, life, liberty, property. Governments lose legitimacy if they breach the social contract. Citizens retain the right to revolution against tyrannical rule. This framework balances majority authority with minority protections, ensuring governance remains tied to its foundational purpose, securing individual rights. Locke's theories laid the groundwork for modern constitutional democracies, checks and balances, inspired the U.S. Constitution's separation of powers, revolutionary justification, the Glorious Revolution, 1688, and American Revolution, 1776, drew on Locke's defense of resisting tyranny. Rule of law. Governments must operate under transparent, consistent rules, not arbitrary decrees, yet Locke's system assumes rationality and moral consensus, overlooking complexities like systemic inequality or partisan gridlock. His optimism about human reason contrasts with Hobbes's bleak view of human nature, but both agree. Government's legitimacy hinges on its utility to the governed. John Locke's political philosophy centers on rejecting arbitrary governance, which he equates with tyranny. For Locke, legitimate authority must justify its actions through rational alignment with the public good, specifically the protection of natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Arbitrary rule, governance-based, on whims, personal interests, or unchecked power, violates these principles. Examples include a leader acting on personal whims or institutions enforcing laws without transparency. Locke argues that such capricious authority erodes trust and fails to serve the community's welfare, making it illegitimate. To prevent tyranny, Locke advocates for a separation of powers, dividing government into legislative and executive branches. The legislature creates universal, known laws grounded in reason, ensuring predictability and fairness. The executive enforces these laws impartially, avoiding ad hoc decisions. This structure prevents concentration of power, ensuring no single entity can manipulate governance for self-interest. While Locke's framework predates modern judicial systems, his emphasis on distinct roles laid groundwork for later models incorporating independent judiciaries. Locke defends majority rule as the most equitable system despite its risks. Unlike monarchy prone to autocracy or unanimity enabling minority obstruction, majority rule reflects collective consent while respecting individual equality. However, Locke acknowledges the danger of majority tyranny. To mitigate this, he ties legitimacy to the protection of natural rights. Laws must serve the common good, not just majority interests. This creates a safeguard. Governments violating rights lose legitimacy, empowering the community to demand accountability or revolution. The right to revolution is pivotal in Locke's theory. If a government becomes tyrannical, ignoring natural rights or acting arbitrarily, the community retains authority to overthrow it. This principle underpinned the Glorious Revolution, 1688, and the American Revolution, as reflected in the Declaration of Independence's grievances against British rule. Locke's argument here is pragmatic. Enduring minor injustices is reasonable, but systemic rights violations justify dissolution of the social contract. Locke's legacy is dual-natured. Classical liberals emphasize his defense of limited government, property rights, and individual autonomy, viewing state intervention as overreach. Conversely, progressive interpretations leverage Locke's focus on universal rights to justify state action, ensuring equitable access to opportunities and resources, such as anti-monopoly regulations or social safety nets. His framework's adaptability explains its enduring influence on constitutional democracies, checks and balances, and debates over governance scope. Ultimately, Locke's contribution lies in demanding accountability and justification from authority. By anchoring legitimacy in the protection of rights and rational governance, he provided a blueprint for balancing majority rule with minority protections, shaping modern democratic thought and institutions. His theories remain a living dialogue, adaptable to evolving notions of justice and equality.